Okay, let's pick up again with part two, comparisons. So you're talking about 40, 50 countries that had lower per capita income than we did, um, over 100 and way over 200 years ago. Um, think about where you'd be doing if you're living in one of those countries as opposed to here. You probably wouldn't be going to college. Maybe you would be. Maybe you'd be attending these lectures via online the way we're doing, but chances are less that you'd be doing that. And so the question is why? Is it the culture? Is it the work ethic? Is it colonialism in which the Western world plundered and pillaged foreign lands? Slavery, institutions, environmental factors, disease, science, open science, lack of science, property rights, economic freedom. Well, most economists attribute it to bad institutions. So if we think about the difference in economic growth, weak institutions, and by institutions, I mean the rule of law, the ability to capture the reward given you took the risk. And when these institutions are bad because of corruption or because of dictatorships or because of monopoly, where there's lack of economic freedom and the state is run by um, corrupt leaders that try to extract all the rents themselves, yeah, it's not really a mystery why these institutions would not support economic growth. I mean, it's when you don't have or you don't when the incentives are misaligned. Let's put it that way. Then you don't have incentive to innovate. You don't have incentive to, um, you know, work as hard coming up with new ideas if you don't get to collect all the rents. So is it a cultural thing why this happens? No, not really. Um, it's a question of being able to define institutions and being able to support the institutions that you define. The U.S. has traditionally sponsored economic freedom and um, secure property rights and has tried to line up risk and reward so that if you take the chances and you make the money, you get to keep it. You have to pay taxes, of course, but that's just the price of a civilized society. And then the question is, well, how many taxes and blah. We'll come back to that on another day, but that's always an issue too. You can kill incentives if you overtax something as well. So the Malthusian trap. So Malthus, you probably heard of. He was a famous economist that talked about declining living conditions due to high birth rates among the poor. So he basically was worried about overpopulation and the fact that uh, people in poverty were having more kids because for lots of reasons. One of them because it provided more labor for the family. It also provided an insurance system for the parents, and he was worried that we're going to have too many people and our food production was not going to be able to be enough to feed ourselves. So if we look at the graph here, before the Industrial Revolution, that's called the Malthusian trap, where we're not able to increase the income per person. We're stuck at a low level of income, $1,000 per person, say, and that doesn't change for centuries. It just stays the same. And people were concerned that we were going to be stuck like this forever. Now, the key then with the Industrial Revolution and the ability to line up good institutions, you can see this hockey stick looking graph that we've seen before, where income per person just shoots up through the roof for some countries, not every country. You can see the other line going down. That's the great divergence idea. Um, that we talked about last lecture. And you can see here, this breaks down some of these inventions, the breakthroughs, the innovation that that happened in terms of this timing. And a lot of it had to do with, again, the ability to innovate and the ability to promote incentives to innovate so that the innovator gets the rewards. That's key to it all. You got to let people take a chance, and if they take a chance on industry and they win, they keep the rewards. And if you sever that link between risk and reward so that you don't reward innovation, um, it still is going to happen, but not at the rate it happens since the Industrial Revolution. And that's the key. So, how do we then explain China's rapid growth in the world economy relative to the United States? And here we're just looking at an older graph, about 10 years old, but it makes the point where China had a lower per capita GDP than we did, more on the order of $3,500 versus our $46,000. So this is 2009, so 11 years ago. But since 1990 till then, China's real change in gross domestic product has been nearly 500%, where in the US it's been 61%. So this is the idea that China, what it ended up doing was privatizing several of their goods and services, especially agriculture, so that farmers who grew good crops could sell it and could keep the money rather than it going to the collective to be shared collectively. They set up a marketplace, a free market for agriculture, and they started expanding that. And by doing so, they essentially opened up their economic system, at least, to economic growth. And given that the bar was so low, they had nothing but economic growth to gain. So it's kind of like, the 90-10 rule again. You get 90% of the way there with 10% of the effort. And so initially, just by opening up the markets, there was so much value to be created by trade, and so much value once you start aligning incentives, again, risk and reward. And as you start aligning these incentives, China had so much room to grow. They just outstripped the US, which had in many ways grown so rapidly back in the 1700s and 1800s that we were sort of at the end of our growth rate. We're, not the end of it, but we had slowed down to 1 or 2% in terms of how we were growing, and China was growing at 10% per year. Take the rule of 72, 10% per year, you're going to double your GDP every 7.2 years. And if we're growing at 1%, we're going to double our GDP every 72 years. Right? So again, this is the rule of 72, which we talked about, and something called the iron law of convergence. Right? So the idea is that every economy will converge over time because they will start using our technologies. They'll come up with new technologies. Better technologies will be even more of a challenge to find as all the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. But the idea of the iron law of convergence is that on average, 2% of the gap between poor and rich nations vanishes every year. So the rich get richer and the poor get richer over time is the argument. Right? This is what economists argue when all boats are rising, is that the poor do have a chance to catch up to the rich. We will discuss that issue next lecture because that's a question of equality and inequality. Okay, in order to do this, we have to introduce this term economic efficiency. And this is the idea of getting the most bang for your buck, right? So it's not technical efficiency like an engineer, but it's economic efficiency. It's getting the most per cost, right? And so we're trying to get the most out of some resource for each dollar spent. And so you're economically efficient when you hit some peak level of performance using the least amount of inputs to achieve this highest amount of outputs, sorry, right? So least amount of inputs to achieve the highest amount of outputs. Easiest way to say it is the most bang for your buck. Okay, and so what you're trying to do is reduce any unnecessary inputs in order to make it run economically efficient. Most value output, least cost. And the key to all this is productivity. And that is where we'll pick up next time.